within the last, let's say, decade for the most part. This is not something new, and it's conversations that we need to have because we're all stakeholders. We're all stakeholders in our communities. And if we're going to protect our communities, this is a conversation that needs to be had. And not only have a conversation, but implement action plans as to what we're going to do collectively to fight against this atrocity to humankind, right? And so I'm so happy to be able to engage with everyone that's on this panel this evening as we look to put in place things that we think that every community, whether it's the school, the district attorney's office, the police departments, who sometimes get it kind of twisted as to how we are to cater to individuals who have been, put in to these type of situations such as human trafficking. And we need to work together to make sure that we do justice for the collective. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for starting us off right. Let's hear from Amber next.
Hi, thank you for the introductions, and I'm also honored to be here with all of the great panelists and our moderator today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to join this conversation about, a really heavy and important topic. I think that it's imperative that we look at the racial component at every single justice issue that's happening in our society and every criminal issue that happens in our country in America. And I also just want to say that the reason why I am here today is because I'm not only involved with student leadership and advocacy for higher education policies and gender equity and racial equity within CUNY, but I'm also a survivor of not only gender-based violence in all of its forms, but more specifically, I'm a survivor of human trafficking. Right here in New York City is where I experienced the majority of the trauma and the human trafficking that I was a part of. And after coming out of that situation physically, it took me a number of years through, different resources, support groups, therapy, and organizations to be able to come out of it mentally, emotionally, right, and spiritually. So even though I physically was removed from the situation, it took years to come out of it in every other capacity. I was still captive in a lot of ways. And through my healing and through my growth, I became so empowered. But I also began to learn all the different communities that were targeted and, the other communities that were considered vulnerable, and find out what other survivors looked like outside of what I had experienced during my situation. And I began to find so often that there was a lot of politicizing doing human trafficking work and human trafficking eradication, and there was a lot of tokenizing that happens to survivors of all forms of gender-based violence, but especially human trafficking. And so I'm very, very passionate and active in trying to not only empower other survivors and other women or victims of any form of gender-based violence to see that, the sky's the limit, there is no glass ceiling anymore. And we can do anything that we put our mind to. All stigma should be broken about what we're capable of and what we're able to accomplish. And our dreams should be just as big as anyone else who's never experienced that form of trauma or that crime in their life. And I'm also very passionate about, calling more awareness to a survivor-centric policy, because there is some conversation as of recent, but you find so often that there's so many people that are trying to be allies or trying to create programs and resources and support for survivors of human trafficking, but without involving the actual voices of the community that they're trying to serve. And I think that that's a huge issue, and I'm very passionate and active in trying to change that. And I'm also currently doing a research project at John Jay about how we can find a better cognitive behavioral therapy approach, or one that's more tailored to human trafficking survivors, so that they can also get the best type of mental health services and therapy that's out there.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you so much for your leadership and for sharing your personal story. And I think sometimes that's what people need to hear, are these personal stories of survivors who are real people who've undergone some horrible things in their lives, and that's how sometimes we get people to connect and find that these are actually important stories. I'm looking forward to hearing much more of what you have to say. I want to turn it over to Christina to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and in conversation about such an important topic, and definitely excited to be centering voices of women of color around this conversation. And I'm an abolitionist, and I say that because modern day slavery is very much alive today. It didn't end, and my work connects chattel slavery and systemic racism and inequality into what's happening today. So I look to combat three forms of modern day slavery, which are human trafficking, punitive incarceration, and immigrant detention. The United States is the epicenter of the planet in our modern day slavery practices. We import, export, we are the leaders in this field in the worst way. And so I think by tackling all three together as systemic injustice is the way to actually eradicate modern day slavery from this earth. So that's what I focus on doing. And I'm gonna stop there, and looking forward to sharing more.
Thank you so much. So let's go to some of the questions, and you've already started to touch upon this first question, and that is that the crime of human trafficking disproportionately has targeted women and children of color, the most common targets being Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. From your perspective and professional experience, why is this demographic targeted in a more heightened way? And I open that up to whoever wants to go first. And if no one speaks, I'll choose. Okay, Dr. Corlett.
You know, as I was saying, that this is not new, right? This is not something that just came up on the scene. Human trafficking has been here, and human trafficking has been embedded in the culture of America, right? As Christina was alluding to, yes, it has been here. The illegal trade of people, the illegal and volatile sexual and I should say raping of women, children, and men has been in the story of America. It has been in the story globally. Okay. And so it's to face the reality of that, to call it what it is, not to ignore it, because it's here and we have to deal with it. And what I think has been a barrier is the false narratives. The false narratives that human trafficking and prostitution is the same. The false narrative that, oh, they wanted to do that. The false narrative that it's happening over there, but not here. The false narrative of it's really not as prominent as they say. Those are all false narratives, right? And another false narrative that I think has been told to society is that Black, Brown, and Indigenous young women and girls are hypersexual. That's something, well, they want it, that's how they are. And also that Black, Brown, and Indigenous girls are not as innocent as Caucasian girls. These are the narratives that have been, you know, have been allowed to just take a stance in society. And we're here to say, and that's why I love that we're having this conversation, because we're here to say no more. We are here to tell the truth. And the truth is that, yes, some of our own people have sold us into these type of situations. Yes, that's the truth. The truth is that also affluent Caucasian middle-aged men are the buyers. That's also the truth. The truth is also that we are looked upon as criminals and not as the victims. The truth is that in this same America, 1 in 6 children in the US live in food insecure households every day. The truth is that little over 100,000 children experience homelessness in America every single night. The truth is that almost 2,000 babies are born into poverty in America. And the truth is that children of color are projected to be the individuals that make up the majority of those children. So when we start to look at those numbers, we start to see, so wait, who are the vulnerable people? Who are the vulnerable children, and where are they in our communities? And so why have they been ignored when we can see that 2/3 of our children are traumatized in this country? By the time they get 16 years old, they could have experienced 2 to 3 different types of trauma. It's because we're not dealing with this. What we've been doing in our country is treating the fruit, but never getting to the root. And that in itself is an injustice. It's time that we see what's happening in our society, acknowledge where it's happening in our society, and coming together to eradicate what's happening in our society. I don't have to have a child to have a voice. Because if I see that every child in my community belongs to me, if I take ownership as a stakeholder and I put my voice to that, I have a vision for the children in my community. I have virtue that allows me to say, I'm not going to divorce what I see and what my actions will be. They have to be married. Race is an issue here when it comes to human trafficking, and of course, on so many other levels, right? And so I think it's time that we face the truth. And so why is it that that's the community that seems to be the community that this is happening to? It goes all the way back to the fact that it was the conditioning of America to sell, to see human beings not as human beings, but as property. And if you are my property, I get to dictate your value. And so because we haven't been valued in our communities by, yes, some members in our communities, but also by others who are not, this is why it's happening to us. And these type of conversations is what it will take as a clinician to be a part of this conversation, to be an advocate for the survivors and for voices that are crying out in the night that I may never meet, but to speak for them anyway. That's what it will take to eradicate this.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right that we're all stakeholders. We all have responsibility to fight for everybody, even if we might not necessarily be as personally connected to them. We're all part of this system, and we want to make sure that we're not complicit in the system. I'm going to go over to Amber next. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspectives as to why you think Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are targeted most by human trafficking?
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, a lot of what Dr. Griffith Hunt just touched on is completely spot on, right? She said it so well, but and I'm in agreement with the fact that, America's ideals and foundation was found not only in the crime of human trafficking, but also colonialism at its root always includes components of violence, and part of that violence is sexual violence, whether it happened to the indigenous, whether it happened to the African people that were brought here in slavery, children, women, and men, like Dr. Griffith Hunt explained, or whether it happens to Asian American and our Latinx communities in the situations of immigration, very similar to what I'm sure that Christina Dawkins will touch on. And there's the piece of hypersexualization, and there's also the piece of thinking that our bodies are property, and that there's an entitlement to us, not only as women, but even as like Black and brown women, right? But the crazy part about it is, what kind of society engages sex with children, right? Like, some of the survivors that are rescued are as young as 8 months old and have been slept with by 23 men. Like, what's wrong with us societally that even exists and is even something that continues to be engaged in? And a lot of agencies are aware of it, but why is it still such a taboo topic? And being that we're disproportionately affected, Black and brown children, women, and and other members of these communities, right? why has there not been more done to eradicate it when we know that there is European models that have worked in smaller countries? You know, you really have to ask yourself that question. Is it because systemically we don't matter to them? So justice does not matter to them? We're literally just a piece of fetishization, just something to, use in the ways that they want to use it and to dispose of it how they want to dispose of it. Again, very similar to just being pieces of property. And that fetishization is like, when you're in a human trafficking ring, like your, trafficker knows that if you're more exotic or if people can't tell what your, multiracial or biracial background is, they'll get more money for you. That's fetishization, right? And yes, there are men of color that, are a part of soliciting human trafficking, but like Dr. Griffith Hunt said, it's majority upper class white men in power, middle class white men with insurance jobs, your publisher, your professor, the judge, the lawyer, the politician, the person who works in the agency that's supposed to be rescuing you. It's these people that are soliciting them. And it is rooted in our history, it's rooted in colonialism. And again, it's just like a blatant disregard and disrespect for our bodies being our own property and for us having say over what happens to us.
Thank you so much. I want to hear from Christina too, and if you could answer that question about why you think this demographic is targeted more, and maybe even talk a little bit more about the history of America of human trafficking and its connection to chattel slavery in this country.
Yeah, sure. So I think the two main reasons are hypercriminalization and invisibility to service providers. It's a terrible paradox that a lot of Black and Brown Indigenous girls live in, where law enforcement hypercriminalizes us. And then when it comes to care and being seen as victims who need help, we're rendered invisible. So slavery has always been connected to capitalism and profit. Human trafficking is a major global industry. And in the United States, it generates $32 billion per year. So this system is most lucrative when victims remain in it for a long time. So traffickers target folks they think will not be missed. And unfortunately, those people are Black, Brown, Indigenous women and girls. Where are the demographic expected to drop out of schools, to move in and out of foster homes, to run away and not be found, to be lost to the criminal legal system? But it is really the system losing us. We are being failed, and society is comfortable with seeing that happen because we're used to it. So the practice of chattel slavery, which is slavery due to a condition, it was race-based in the United States. That's ended with the 13th Amendment, but I'm sure, as probably everyone on the call already knows, that the 13th Amendment only abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. So immediately, convict leasing began, where Black folks would be arrested for jaywalking, loitering, minor acts that white folks did all the time, but were never criminalized for. You fast forward to Reagan's war on drugs, crack was sentenced 40 times higher than cocaine, intentionally criminalizing Black folks. Now, we use drugs instead of white folks who use cocaine. Now we've got mass incarceration. 22% of the incarcerated population in the planet is in the United States. I'm not going to go into all of those statistics, but what that has to do with human trafficking is that 90% of survivors report being arrested at least once. Many report being arrested a dozen times. This is across organizations. There is no separating human trafficking from incarceration. Those systems work together. So many sex trafficking victims are criminalized for truancy, drug possession, solicitation, and prostitution. That's assumed to be voluntary because prejudice is based on race, gender, socioeconomic status. So victims are being criminalized because they look like prostitutes, and we're being passed over by people who are supposed to help us. So we're in a time where race-based slavery is unpalatable, right? But cruel and degrading treatment of humans still is if we think they deserve it. And that label we give them are criminal. That is how we dehumanize people today. So human trafficking is similar to what it's always been, only we're not selling people in public squares, we're selling them privately, underground.
Thank you for sharing. Everything that everyone is saying is so on point. And, you know, one of the things that comes to my mind is this impact of systemic racism, you know, because like Christina had mentioned, people who are viewed as not being missed, Black, Brown, Indigenous girls and women, that it's not viewed as a problem in this country. And I wonder, like, what if human trafficking targeted mostly white women? Would this have be viewed as a national policy that people need to address right away? And we know the answer to that. We know that the answer is that because, similarly to what other panels had mentioned, that these girls are viewed as disposable. These girls and women and other folks are viewed as disposable. And I wonder, you know, even thinking about LGBTQ folks, and particularly transgender people, who anecdotally and through community organizing and, you know, different groups we know are also involved in human trafficking, but oftentimes are under-researched. And I'm wondering if maybe Amber, if you might want to speak a little bit about how we can include transgender people in the conversation in a fight against human trafficking.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Nadal. So I'm sure that, you know, the other panelists can also probably agree with this, but there's always a disproportionate amount of people targeted by human trafficking when they identify with being like a vulnerable or at-risk community, right? And so there was a recent study by the Polaris Project that revealed that homeless LGBTQ youth are 7 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence or possibly come into the crime of human trafficking and be targeted for this if more than their heterosexual like counterparts, right? And there was also a research study that said that the 56% of transgender youth are involved in the sex trade. But again, we're gonna go back to, right, elevating the voices of the people that are being affected. There's very minimal research around what's happening to the trans community, whether they're victims of human trafficking or if they're active participants in prostitution. Like, there's very, very small amounts of research that I know that exists right now, even locally. And I think that that's a disservice to this community, because the study that I just read out for you guys says that they're disproportionately affected and that over half of the transgender youth are involved in the sex trade at some point in time in their life, right? So why is that? What leads them to that situation, and why are they underrepresented, right? I think that maybe there's a lot of stigmas around victimology that still need to be torn down and reconstructed, right? So often we think that we know what a victim of human trafficking or the sex trade looks like. And there's also a lot of really bad stigmas around LGBT plus youth and trans women and trans men when it comes to like promiscuity, or saying that they want to be active participants in this, very similar to what we talked about with Black and brown women and children, right? It's a more heightened stigma that is placed on and automatically assumed about our LGBTQ youth and our trans youth. And I think that that's like a very harmful discrimination that's keeping people from even seeing them as victims, even people who are doing the research and doing the work, right? There's so little understanding about the needs of the trans community, even within CUNY. God, imagine what the understanding is of the trans needs within, you know, a crime as serious as human trafficking. We know for a fact that there's even a lack of adequate housing and homeless shelters and support services for LGBTQ plus youth, even here in New York City. And so there's lots of gaps, right, of how we could be supporting this community more, but also just making sure that there is research and conversations that are elevating their voices in some capacity, even if they're not ready or willing to come forward and talk on behalf of themselves, but someone else that they trust and they feel is a safe advocate to represent them could elevate their voices so that they're not left out of the conversation because they're suffering silently. And because there's a lack of research and because there's a lack of conversations around this, who's fighting for them? Who's bringing their specific issues and the reasons why they're more vulnerable to the table? I don't have an answer for you yet.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think, one of the things that we're hearing about are the ways that people of historically marginalized groups are criminalized and pathologized when in fact they are victims and survivors. And that some of the ways that systemic oppression negatively affects them then becomes the reasons why they're viewed as not human or disposable or blamed for their actions. And so, even just thinking with my own work on LGBTQ folks in the criminal justice system, similar to what you had mentioned, Amber, this idea that majority of LGBT or the majority of homeless youth in New York City are LGBTQ identified. Most of them run away from their homes or are kicked out of their homes, and so now you have young people living on the streets with nothing else to do, no prospects for jobs. What else are they going to do, right? So they might engage in things like sex work. They might engage in drug use or drug selling or any other sorts of things that are viewed as crime. And so then they can become criminalized for that, as opposed to recognizing that perhaps because of systemic oppression, heterosexism, homophobia, that got them into this situation to begin with. And again, we see this also with what we're talking about, what Christina mentioned in terms of, when girls get involved in like truancy and other sorts of smaller crimes, what are the effects of systemic oppression that got them into those situations to begin with? I'm curious to hear, we haven't heard from Dr. Griffith Hunt in a little while. Any thoughts about this role of systemic oppression and particularly racial oppression and how this affects people becoming targeted by human trafficking?
And I completely agree with what everyone has been saying, because when we look at it from a perspective of trauma, right, and a cognitive standpoint of how historical trauma takes place here. So we're dealing with historical trauma, we're dealing with collective trauma, we're dealing with just the complexities, emotional trauma. There's so much that's occurring here, and what we're not realizing is that it just doesn't affect the way that, and racism, it doesn't just affect how someone feels. We say that a lot. Oh, I feel that this is an injustice. I feel, but how does the brain record this as it relates to trauma? And when we have this type of trauma, this complexity of trauma, we have to understand that our bodies are feeling it. And we don't talk about, whenever I'm in these panels or, just presenting, it's never brought to the forefront that the individuals, whether they are LGBTQ plus, whatever it is, they are going through, whoever it is, it could be African-American, LGBTQ plus, it could be indigenous people, brown people, they are experiencing trauma, and no one is speaking about how sick they become because of the trauma that they experience. Because cognitively, there's so many, I like to use the example, when you get a paper cut and it hurts and it's annoying at first, but then a couple of days after, you forget that the paper cut was even there. And that's because your body automatically sent out a message, heal that area. Right? And so before you know it, 2 days, you say, oh, wow, I did have a paper cut, but it's gone. But what happens to the individual whose trauma, whose pain, the injustice that they have gone through is not something tangible like the paper cut, but it's inside. It's their spirit, it's their soul. It's their heart, it's their kidneys, because all of these things, our systems become affected by all of these things. And we don't talk about, what they are physically, what do individuals physically go through? And that's another component that we need to discuss. So we're dealing now with high blood pressure, our children, our homeless youth, they have asthma. They have high blood pressure. Trauma can give diabetes, and people don't know. And so when you start to look at, though I have not said anything to anyone, I don't know who to turn to say that this is an injustice that's being done to me. Though you haven't verbalized it, the secret that you are holding, your liver has heard. Your kidney has heard it. Your every part of your system has heard it, and our children are sick on the street. And these are conversations we have to have as well. As a clinician, I have to look at the entire person. When I advocate for their rights, I have to think, my goodness, do they need medication? And because of people's biases and their prejudice, concepts of who should be given what, that no one is catering to our children. It doesn't matter their sexual orientation or what group you classify them in. They're human. And we have to give them value. But if you're living in a society where we are functioning only according to, our own biases that have not been unpacked and prejudice and so forth, we are causing harm. And that's another component that I think we need to discuss when we're thinking about this. If we're going to talk about it in its totality, we have to talk about that as well.
Thank you so much. And you're right that we don't talk about trauma enough. I think, within communities of color, there have been more conversations, but in academia, in social justice movements, we don't talk about trauma as much as we should. And we know that there's historic trauma that travels through us and through across generations. We know that there's collective trauma that we experience, even if something didn't happen to us directly, but happened to somebody in your community. We also know that even, there's some beginning studies on just epigenetics and just trauma running through our blood and having direct effects on our health. And I'm glad you brought up health, because we do know that there are so many different health disparities affecting our communities in so many different ways, ranging from cardiovascular disease to diabetes to cancer, to all these sorts of things. And how might these be related? Because what a lot of research studies will show is that there are strong, significant correlations between discrimination and violence with these health disparities. And then you have survivors of human trafficking who have additional stressors that they experience as well. Christina, I want to hear back from you. Can you tell us a little bit more about ways that systemic oppression and racism may manifest in the sex trafficking industry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, human trafficking really relies on systems of oppression, and it reflects the opportunity gap in America that is very racialized. So the more marginalized you are, the more vulnerable, the more precarious your status or position is, the more at risk you are to be trafficked. And we know these folks are overwhelmingly Black, Indigenous, women and girls of color. That's who is most vulnerable. And so it reflects systems of oppression operating in every level. I've talked about attitudes and stereotypes, and so did Amber and Dr. Corland, that it leaves us more vulnerable to sex trafficking, but also less likely to be identified or seen as victims. So when there are actual laws and policies that enable this to happen, there are ways that law enforcement can actually label a child as a repeat runaway or a non-critical missing child. And this is a status that actually exists. And why do we have this status? It is a way to systematically underserve people of color. But 80% of children who run away are approached by a trafficker within 48 hours. So these are the kids we should be chasing after, because other people are. If people who want to help and care for them aren't going after these missing children, other people are looking for them. And that is how this harm really hits our community. So we have to end policies that enable trafficking of BIPOC folks. And I want to bring in immigrant detention, because sex trafficking really benefits from a racist criminal legal system. It is really thriving off of xenophobia. It's been on a steady increase over the past 10 years, and it's gone up over the past 4 years as there has been increased xenophobia especially along the US-Mexico border. So traffickers find easy prey when a culture of bias and discrimination prevents people from seeking safety that they deserve, and it leads them to distrust people who ought to protect them. So in trying to get to the United States and avoid detention, human trafficking is a result, because legal, humane methods for exercising your right to seek asylum, your right to self-determination, your right to movement, those rights aren't being respected. And that makes human trafficking thrive. It's also thriving in this, COVID system, right? The pandemic is underserving people who were already vulnerable. They're becoming more vulnerable now. It's really a trifecta of racial injustice and unrest, this health crisis, and there's a crisis at the border. So this is all leading human trafficking numbers to go up, and it's making it harder for activists and organizers to actually know what's happening in immigrant detention centers and what's happening in jails and prisons where a lot of these victims are being held. So I think the last thing I want to mention is that sex trafficking reflects systemic patriarchy and this intersectionality of race, gender, and class. And we see this in how victims are prosecuted for solicitation or prostitution, while courts slap Johns or procurers, just slaps them on the wrist, right? But the girls and women get their mugshots posted online. And this is a way that Department of DOC websites where mugshots and profiles are publicly available, this serves as a marketing tool for traffickers. This allows them to easily recruit and target the most vulnerable people. So we have these systems in place that are fueling trafficking, and we have to really combat this at a systemic level.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm learning so much as well. And it really just goes to show just how systemic all of this is. And, I wonder, back to what we were earlier talking about, that it's something that's been in existence in our country, or what is now known as our country, because we know this country is founded on stolen lands. We know that people were violently removed from their lands to build this country. Yet we don't want to believe that this is something that could actually still be a thing here when our country is founded on violence. I want to move back to Amber. Can you tell me a little bit? I know you mentioned earlier about an intersectionality-based approach. Can you tell me about why that's so important in this movement?
Yes, so it's going to be a multifaceted answer, but I want to just touch on something that Christina had spoke about earlier because it's at the forefront of my mind. So gender-based violence is the umbrella term for human trafficking and other forms of interpersonal violence, right, that we experience disproportionately at times. And Christina talked about the 13th Amendment. So, and how we moved from one form of slavery into another with mass incarceration, right? Now, when you begin to do a deep dive into the populations of women's prisons in America, and you look at specific cases like the women's prison in Florida, where lots of women were not only being trafficked, but also sexually assaulted and exploited by corrections officers, and there was an entire DOJ investigation, right? You'll find that quite often it's very similar to Angela Davis in the book Women, Race, and Class, where she talks about when we talk about the experience of slavery in America, you do not see enough narrative or conversation around what the Black woman went through, right? And so it's very similar to what you'll see in mass incarceration. A lot of these women, especially even at Rikers, have had some form of sexual or domestic violence, right, before coming into Rikers. And then a lot of them also have had some experience, or a good number of them had some experience with human trafficking. They are re-traumatized by sexual violence in these arenas like prisons or Rikers Island, and just also doctors and mental health professionals within the corrections that don't necessarily understand a trauma-centric approach, right? So then they're re-traumatized because they're dealt with as a criminal because they're incarcerated. But what might have led them to that incarceration? Intersectionality again. Why did they commit the crime? Until Cyntoia Brown's story became famous and everyone began to put attention on that and make it, gain national traction, we really didn't have any real example or affirmation of someone who might have committed a crime because of the trauma of human trafficking and abuse before human trafficking. And so I just wonder how often intersectionality is still not a part of the conversation when it comes to our women that become incarcerated, and how often the state violence of sexual violence is happening in these, you know, arenas and in these places where they're incarcerated, and it's another form of traumatization but also dehumanization. And again, the thing with survivors is that so often professionals or organizations, whether they knowingly do it or don't do it consciously, like to come up with the ideal survivor, right? And I've found quite often that sometimes they don't even vet to make sure that that survivor is ready or has had enough mental health treatment to tell their story over and over again. Do you think that it's very healthy for a survivor to be auctioned off at a gala for donations because they're saying, I survived this and now I'm in college, I survived this, got my children back, and now I have a regular job, right? I don't know if that's healthy or safe for a lot of our survivors. And I can honestly say in my experience that not everybody is as wary and as sensitive to make sure that these people are ready. But also there's the problem of the ideal survivor, right? How do you expect one survivor to speak for all survivors when we're all different? There's organizations in New York City who solely look at, you know, survivors that are teens. There are people who look at survivors that are from the LGBTQ plus community. There are organizations that solely look after survivors that are here because they were undocumented or came in through immigration and their papers are being held. We're all different. What we experience may be similar, but it may be very different. And to assume that we can speak for all of the people that have gone through what we've gone through is in some ways empowering, but in some ways a disservice to us. And so it gets even deeper. How do you provide adequate services and resources to survivors if you think that all survivors are exactly the same, that all of the conditions that led us to human trafficking are exactly the same, and if you think that the needs that we have to, you know, access therapy or to get into higher education or to get our documentation back or whatever it is for us to acclimate back into society as what they call a normal citizen, right? If you think that it always looks like the same little package, similar to what Dr. Griffith Hunt said earlier, that again is ignorant in my opinion, and it's a disservice to the survivors. And so without doing more of an intersectional approach into how you treat survivors, how you support them, and the different people that are part of these organizations, there's so many of us that are probably falling through the cracks.
Thank you so much. That was really well stated. And I want to, you mentioned services, and I think that's a great way to transition to Dr. Griffin Hunt on, you know, your work with specifically with young Black girls and women. And I know that you talk about the differences between treatment versus healing. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approaches to practice and professional work? And before you go, I want to acknowledge that we have a few questions, and so I want to be mindful of time. So we'll spend some time answering that, and then we'll go to the audience for some final questions. So audience members, if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get them before the end of the hour. So Dr. Griffith Hunt.
I'll make sure that I'm brief. Amber, oh my goodness, I'm sitting here going, yes, you know, because that is exactly it. We have to stop this textbook form of treating people, this textbook model, you know, this one size fits all, or at least one size might fit most, because you are an individual and I have to cater to you individually. Now, yes, there may be things that may be similar that happened when it comes to two individuals, but we have to see them individually. And that's how I treat. I treat the individual that's in front of me. And one of the things, and that's why I mentioned the systems in our bodies that could be affected by what we've been through. And so it has to be in a holistic way. It has to be in a way where I'm not treating you to keep you, but we're in this whole concept of this process, this journey of healing together, where I can help you to know how to use the tools. You see what we've been doing, and that's why I mentioned earlier that we've been treating the fruit and not the root, because here it is that I'm supposed to give the tools. I'm supposed to show you the tools, but also show you how to use the tools so that you are self-reliant, you can self-regulate, you can emotionally regulate, and that you don't need me to hold your hand for the rest of your life. Now, Big Pharma and a lot of other clinicians believe that you have to hang out with me for the rest of your life. No, I'm supposed to be able to say, we can create a plan. These are the goals. Now it's challenging. It's going to be challenging because what happened to an individual didn't happen overnight, right? I've had a client who was stolen at age 6 and was freed at age 24. So that wasn't overnight. And so the treatment can take a while, but I have to have, as a clinician, a vision that you will be whole. I have to have a vision that, you know, there's something that I have when I'm with my clients. I say, we have a validation code. You're not allowed to say to me, oh, Dr. Hunt, you're the best. Oh, Dr. Hunt, you're beautiful. Dr. Hunt, you're wonderful. You cannot identify my identity if you deny your own. So it's about getting the client that's in front of me to the place where they know they're worthy, a place where they know they have value, and that what they have experienced did not devalue who they are. And that is a stage that takes a while because they have been used as property, because someone has used them to gain financially, to gain their economic status. And so getting a client to a place where they are really receiving trauma-informed care, where they're the leader of the conversation, where they're the leader of the process, of the journey, to get them to know that they are valuable and they have a right to let their life speak. And as long as they have space on the earth, that space is theirs. And as long as it takes for them to feel validated about who they are, because they're worthy of their existence. And to understand that what has happened to you is not the definition of who you are. And I like to tell my clients, listen, you're so valuable that I will not be who I am without you. It's about having them understand that no matter what society says, and no matter what sometimes the family member wants a quick fix. They'll come to me with Dr. Hunt, Dr. H, how long is it gonna take? You know, I'm saying, she went through this like 6 years ago and she's still going, you know, hey, it's a process. And when they're ready, they'll move through the various steps. And I'm just here as, you know how you have a building and you have this scaffolding around the building, and people don't understand that the scaffolding is really holding the building up, but you see that beautiful building being made, I'm scaffolding. They are the beautiful building that's being restructured, and to get them to see that that empty canvas is now something beautiful and that is priceless. That's what healing is about. And what tops it for me is when an individual calls and says, Dr. Hunt, I'm beautiful. Dr. Hunt, I love you. Because they know the validation code is, you can't say it to me till you believe it about you. Then I know healing has taken place. It's not about pushing medication across the table. It's not about being able to say, well, what insurance do you have? Because let's be realistic. Some of them come out and never filled out an application. They don't have insurance. And so do I turn them away because they don't have insurance? Absolutely not. Because if I am here for humanity, if I see a vision for humanity, Desmond Tutu, I'll end it with this. Desmond Tutu said, My humanity is bound up in your humanity, for we can only be human together. There is no way for healing to exist if we are not together. We are birthed through relationship, we are hurt through relationship, but guess what? It takes relationship to bring the healing. And so I tell people, I may never get the yacht and the mansion, because that's what treatment might give some folk. Healing is where the work happens. And healing, for a lot of us who are in the healing work, we don't get the from the outside, but we get it from our clients. And that in itself is priceless. So it's about bringing healing to them, bringing wholeness to them on this journey, opposed to just thinking about it from a treatment standpoint. And I'll end it there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, hearing you talk was healing for me. I wish I had you as my therapist. No offense to my therapist if they're listening. But also, you know, I hope that more therapists are like you. Like, I know as a psychologist myself, as a trained psychologist, I know that so many therapists are not trained to show that level of empathy and humanity, and you know, and in fact, to be quite honest, a lot of people will pathologize any survivor, and specifically survivors of human trafficking. Again, like what you had said, the stereotypes of they wanted it, they asked for it, it's their fault, they're sexualized, whatever it may be. And so, you know, thank you for demonstrating how we hope many or all therapists, clinicians should be in working with survivors. You know, we have a few questions here. I mean, we only have a minute. And so I don't know if we're gonna get to the questions, but what I will say, I wanna acknowledge these questions as things that maybe we can talk about in the future. One question is about the relationship between the movement to decriminalize sex work and its relationship to trafficking. Another question is opinions on the prosecution of traffickers as a mean of rooting out trafficking and alternatives to prosecuting traffickers and the criminal justice system from an abolitionist perspective. And then another question is about police and what are some of the interactions with police. I think all three of those questions are all separate panels that could possibly happen. Hopefully this will be a continued series that we have, but you know, to be mindful for time, you know, I think we'll end here, but I want to thank each and every one of you for sharing your perspectives. I learned so much from this panel. I'm sure all of the audience members learned so much from this panel. I hope it's, you know, the first of many more conversations to be had. I hope that you all continue to do this work. And to everyone watching, I hope that you all recognize that we're all stakeholders, as Dr. Griffin-Tom said. We all have to do the work. So as we end today, think about how you're going to do the work starting now. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night and stay safe, stay healthy, and keep fighting the revolution. Thank you.